What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Crown Jewels. I am PLD, your host on the PLD Projects Network. We have reached the fourth track on the Sheer Heart Attack album. This is all about Flick of the Wrist. But of course, if you are new here on the YouTube channel, you can hit that like, hit that subscribe, leave me a comment. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any of the audios like that, hit the subscribe, follow, leave a comment, or leave us a review. Those all really help. I would really appreciate that. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. Flick of the Wrist was a track written by Freddie Mercury. Got Freddie on lead backing vocals, piano, but Brian May on guitars and backing vocals, John on bass, Roger Taylor's on drums, percussion, and backing vocals. This song is really a precursor of the song Death on Two Legs from A Night at the Opera. It's the first and definitely less famous song Freddie wrote about their increasing disillusionment with their management company. Surprisingly enough, it took the management took more offense at the second one, as this one actually seems far more specific to me. I mean, we'll get to Death on Two Legs when we get to Night at the Opera, but I always felt this is actually a little more pointed at the management. But hey, who am I to judge? Interestingly enough, it was released as the double A side to Killer Queen. If you don't know what that means, I'm going to get a little old school on you. Back in the day, singles were released on vinyl, and it was the A side. Flip it over was the B side. Usually the single was on the A side, and then an unknown track or a lesser known track would be on the B side. In this case, some songs had double A sides. Killer Queen and Flick of the Wrist were both on the A side, so technically speaking, Flick of the Wrist had all the same success that Killer Queen did, making it probably one of the least known international hits of all time. The band did play it live on tour through 1976, and it was dropped from the set and never to appear again. Probably most likely because of the similarities to Death on Two Legs as far as thematically speaking, and Death on Two Legs was the more popular of the two tracks, so it would make sense that they would go more with Death on Two Legs than Flick of the Wrist. Well, here we are now. It's time to listen to all the versions and try to determine which is the crown jewel, as well, of course, as ranking them and giving it a rating of 1 to 11, because we always turn it up to 11 here on PLD Projects. See if it hits that top 10 of mine. Now, if you look at the description below, you'll see I have links to my Spotify playlist you can listen to. I have links to my Google Sheets that you can follow up with. I have all the different versions, as well as links to YouTube videos that you can listen to them. Of course, I have the album version, studio version, the single version, the Japan single version, the US single version, the Dutch single version, the Best 16 version, the UK CD single version, the BBC session, the instrumental demo, and Live at the Rainbow, November of 1974. But we don't have to listen to all of them. The majority of them are actually just a slight edit here and there because the track does segue from Tenement Funster, the previous track, and does segue into Lily of the Valley, the next track. So the single versions were basically just ways they could make it standalone. So I'll just listen to one. I'll let you know how they differ, and I'll rank them within that little grouping of tracks. But the only ones you really have to pay attention to and listen to at that point are the studio version, the one single versions, the BBC session, the instrumental demo, which we don't even have a link for, which I'll just talk about briefly, and then Live at the Rainbow 1974. Well, there you have it. Those are the versions we're going to be going to. First, of course, is going to be the studio version, the one that's on Sheer Heart Attack itself. Click that link below, listen to it, and come back, and we'll talk about it.
Dislocate your spine if you don't sign, he says. I'll have you see it double.
All right, there we have it. This is always kind of somewhat of a forgotten gem for me. I don't tend to think about it too often. I kind of don't remember how much I like it until I listen to it. But when I do listen to it, I realize there's a lot going on here. I like how it's brought in playfully with some great piano. Again, this is a segue from Tenement Funster. Has some piano, some swirling guitar, some groovy bass, and then some rhythmic grooves from Roger. Roger's always very good at that kind of like leading that just behind the beat in a way. Freddie has an interesting vocal track on the first verse, and all the verses really. He doubles that lead track with like a higher and lower octave harmonies. Brian just has some great wandering guitar throughout. Basically, Brian just goes throughout the entire song, and there's always a Brian maybe, I don't know if riff is the right word. It's not really a riff. He just kind of goes through and adds some texture to it. There's a nice rhythmic leading up to the Don't Look Back pre-chorus. Don't look back, don't look back. It's a ripoff, and the chorus is really rollicking. I do love this chorus quite a bit. Some strong backing vocals. The drums are going powerfully. It feels like a real rock and roll number until it climaxes at the drop off. The Baby You've Been Had, just by Freddie by himself. Nice ethereal falsetto vocals. Goes through it again. But instead, after the pre-chorus, instead of getting another chorus, that's where you hit the guitar solo, these drum rolls. Like, it's not even drum filled, it's just all the way throughout, while this mini jam session grooves on. Get a nice little solo there before we go back to the double D track again, and goes into a little bit of a different pre-chorus now for the final portion of it. It's very much a Queen tune-like set of harmonies, like right out of March of the Black Queen. It's kind of got this really groovy kind of thing before it goes back into another rollicking chorus, and then it's almost abruptly. What you don't hear on that video, you don't hear is a final line that "Baby, you've been had again," like "Baby, you've been had." But it's not on the album version. It actually begins the next track, Lily of the Valley. That really is kind of the end of this track, and that's where you'll see as we listen to the different single versions. But that's this track. Before we start ranking, going any further, let's get into those single versions. All right, we're back. Let's break down the differences in the single versions again and the compilation version. This is all basically to make it a standalone or not. I'll give these in reverse order of my favorite to least favorite and why. My least favorite is the US single version. The single is basically, it starts off the same, no piano intro. The end phase, kind of intro, goes into Lily of the Valley a little bit further than most, and it basically just shifts everything. It's almost like they took a snapshot, a flick of the wrist, moved everything over a couple seconds. So it's probably it's just the worst one of the edits for myself. It takes way too much into Lily of the Valley and starts way too late into Flick of the Wrist to really be a proper version for me. So that's why it's my least favorite of those. Next up from there, we have the UK 3-inch CD singles. As part, like I mentioned these before, in 1988, and throughout the released all the singles on these little mini CD versions, and they put like more than extra tracks on everything else. The separation tracks were a little bit different here and there. This one, it starts right from the last chord of Tenement Funster, so it's really early. The end of the track does end with the All This Time Honey, just like the album version, which to me I don't really like anyway. I prefer the Baby You've Been Had being a part of the song, so it really does no justice to either side of it, really. A little bit better than the US single, but still altogether not a great edit for me. From there, we have the Best 16. There was a compilation that was released only in Japan on cassette. It's basically a greatest hits type album called Best 16 or 16 Best, and they threw together a bunch of tracks, and one of them was Flick of the Wrist, and it's hard to tell because it was on cassette, so it didn't break it up like a CD track, so you couldn't have it simply as it is. It had a Flick of the Wrist without Tenement Funster to begin, and it has it going into Lily of the Valley, right? So it has the whole song Lily of the Valley, so it's hard to judge where the actual ending would be necessarily on the track. It does cut off the segue from Tenement Funster pretty much. It starts off with the guitars, the Wander guitar over that piano intro. So it cuts off a lot of the piano intro, which I don't love. And it also ends, like I said, after the All This Time Honey part. So I'm not a big fan of that as well. Next up from there, we have the Japanese single version. This is definitely a unique edit in terms of it wasn't the same as the US single or the UK single. The initial piano intro is really edited off the beginning, again, leaving the track to start with that guitar squeal, just like the Best 16 version, and it does end abruptly with the guitar squeal after Baby You've Been Had. So I did like the ending a bit more. That's why I would move this up just a smidge, but the intro is still a little wonky for my ears. Up from there, we do have the regular single version. This is a standalone. It does have a slightly shortened piano opening. It does end with the Baby You've Been Had lyrics. It's almost everything good. It has this nice drawn guitar, like, wow, at the end, which it works as far as a standalone goes. But finally, from there, we have what I consider the best of these single versions, the Dutch single version. It's a real standalone version. It has all of the piano intro, the full piano opening, and it ends with that Baby You've Been Had and that drawn out guitar, like, wow, at the end there. So that makes it the best of the single version for myself. Of course, is it the crown jewel? It depends. I mean, for Tenement Funster, I use a live version, so in a way, I'm looking for a standalone version. This might be the case. I might prefer the album version in general, but because of what I did initially, I might have to go with the Dutch single version. If that's the case, I do end up going with the Dutch single version, not like the BBC version, the live version, as I'm going to listen to soon. In order for you guys to listen to it on Spotify, I'll probably just include the album version because there is no Dutch single version to be had on Spotify. But it won't make it that big of a difference anyway because we're going from the live version of Tenement Funster. So let's go on now to move on to the next version to listen to. That is the BBC session from 1974. And there's the BBC session from October of 1974. This is like the single version, the standalone version, to start off with a full piano intro. It's actually pretty much the same as the album version. As I mentioned before, on a lot of the BBC tracks, Queen used to use the album track and then maybe add some new elements to it to make it different. There's a new Freddie vocal on here, and then Brian's guitar. They add electric guitar, especially a guitar solo. Freddie's voice, though, isn't quite as strong, and I know the mix isn't doing him any favors. The harmonized lead vocals don't really come across as distinct. They kind of get buried over each other. Freddie seems a little tired. He does try to compensate with some interesting takes, but it doesn't really quite work as well as the album version. The guitar solo is completely different. It's awfully mixed. I don't know who did the mix for this. It sounds like exactly what it is. Like somebody just kind of plugged in and played over the top of a completed track and didn't really think, I mean, it doesn't even sound like he cared too much whether it really truly fit or not, especially if that's the way it's going to be mixed. It's just subtly different than the actual album mix. Very loud, very over the top. I wasn't a fan of it. It does end with The Baby You've Been Had, which I like the better ending that way with the swirling trailing guitar note. But overall, it's a little bit of a disappointing track overall from Queen, considering how good of a track it was on the album. It's not awful, but there's definitely pieces of it that make me go, that one's not for me. Now, before we go on listening to that final version and make our complete list and rankings, one more thing I do have to mention. There is an instrumental demo that was played at a convention. I know a YouTube video for it. I actually have never heard it. I don't have it in my collection. I'm sure some Queen fans do have it out there. I know it was leaked because it was definitely in some descriptions of tracks that have been heard by various people. From what I've heard, it doesn't sound much different than the album version. Again, it's just kind of probably an earlier collections, probably just Freddie on piano, Brian on some guitar, maybe just Freddie, John, and Roger at that point. Could be just there's the three of them before Brian had to add the guitar over the top of it. I wish I could hear it, but it would have been, of course, covered by the property of Queen Productions. So maybe one day we'll get a Sheer Heart Attack Deluxe Edition that will include some of these instrumental demos that were leaked earlier on. But that's it for that. Let's go on to the final version we're going to listen to. We have one officially released live version. This comes from the Live at the Rainbow 74 box set. This is the November concert. Let's listen now to Flick of the Wrist, Live from the Rainbow. Well, there you have it, Live at the Rainbow. I have the audio version down there as well as the full video version. The reason I put the audio version is because it's the official version released on the Queen YouTube page. The video is a remastered version from a fan, but I do like it. I think it's great to see the visuals with it as well. It's a great version. This is very, it just shows how good of a band Queen is when they have to cover a lot of things that they can't do in the studio, but they do enough to make it, make a blah, 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 blah. They shift around and make sure to hit the most interesting parts. We do have Freddie playing the piano opening to begin the song. Once the singing starts, he bands the piano and plays to the crowd because that's what he's doing at this point, becoming much more of a showman. Of course, Brian's playing is a little more, it seems a little more timid here, but really it's only because he has to cover the rhythmic portion of the guitar. You can't have the rhythm and that like loose wandering solo guitar over the top because he's got to make sure that rhythm is hammered down. Freddie's usually has, I don't know if the word rougher live vocals is what is, I don't know if that's the right terminology for it, but Freddie's voice is always definitely a little less smooth live. It's definitely more rockier, a little more gruffer when he does the live versions. And that really works for this song. Sometimes it doesn't work as well for some of the ballads they do. For this song, with the deep bile he's got in this lyrics here, it really does work well for this song. Of course, now during the guitar solo portion, Freddie returns to the piano and helps cover the rhythm so Brian can really let loose and really do a rip-roaring guitar solo portion. And this version does end with the Baby You've Been Had, but instead, as an interesting note here, if you listen, you're like, what the hell is that? That's the end of Brighton Rock. The end of, they go from Baby You've Been Had, instead of fading out or instead of doing a last chord, they do that last little like 10-second from Brighton Rock. I think it's an interesting way to juxtapose the songs. I thought it was kind of an ingenious way to do it. Overall, it's a pretty cool version.
Dislocate your spine if you don't sign, he says. I'll have you see it double.
All right, then, without further ado, let's rank the different versions and find out which is the crown jewel. First off, though, I'm going to rate the track. What number am I going to give it from 1 to 11? Because we always go up to 11 here on PLD Projects. I'm going to give this one a solid 9.5. Not one of my absolute favorites, but I do like it more and more I listen to it, and hoping that by giving it a really high score, it'll make me listen to it a little bit more. So let's see how this fares. Just flick of the wrist, make my top 10 Queen songs or Queen-related songs so far at 9.5. The bottom 7 through 10 are all at 9.5. And I'm happy to say it does make it. It slides in just in at number 10, pushing Father to Son out of the list. Flick of the wrist is at number 10 for now. So it probably will be kicked out before too long, but at least it enjoys a little time in the sun. So let's go back now and rank these bad boys in order from least to best, and then we'll declare which one is the crown jewel and which one will go on the Queen main playlist, which is on YouTube Music, since I can include unofficially released or out of print stuff that I have in my own collection. At the bottom, we have the BBC session from October of 1974. I don't think that's any surprise if you were listening. I was not a huge fan of this. Brian's guitar is a little overpowering and not in a good way. Freddie's voice is not quite as strong as the studio version. That's why it ends up here. Here we have next the US single version. I already talked about that. Then the UK's 3-inch CD single version. Then the Best 16 version. Those are my least favorite of the single versions because of the different ways they kind of butchered the track in terms of where it started and where it ended. Right there, before we go into the other single versions, that's where I'll slide into Live at the Rainbow 74. I do like the live version. I think it's definitely better than those butchered single versions, but still not quite as good as the overall studio versions because the band can do so much more. I appreciate all the extra Brian May Wander guitar and Freddie's vocals. While the rough version does work in the live setting, I do prefer the more crystallized, harmonized vocals. Makes it sound a little more creepy, a little more rhythmic. I appreciate that a little bit more. From there, we get the single version. So really, it comes down to the album version or the Dutch single version, which is the crown jewel. Well, folks, I won't leave you in suspense any longer. The crown jewel for PLD, and the one that will be on the Queen main playlist and the Queen complete playlist, is the Dutch single version, a true standalone version. I did that specifically because I did have Tenement Funster from the Roger Taylor live Outsider Tour live album from 2022. So that means I needed a standalone version, so the album version doesn't quite work as well because it doesn't segue as well. Now, for the rest of you who do not have YouTube Music and access to that, for the Spotify listener, the Queen Light crown jewels, I'm going to just put the album version as it's the one you all have, and it's definitely better than the other officially released live versions that are still in print, the Live at the Rainbow or the BBC session. So there you have it. There we go. What a great track, and I can't wait for you guys to come back for the next one to finish out this little medley of sorts. It's a slow track. It's a small track, short track. It's called Lily of the Valley. That will be next week here on PLD Projects. And speaking of PLD Projects, like I said it before, I'll say it again real quick. If you're on YouTube, hit that like or subscribe. Leave some comments. Tell me what you think about Flick of the Wrist. Let me know what you think of my decision. If you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. Please follow me there as well. And if you want more, join the Patreon at PLD Projects. Patreon.com/PLD Project. You can join fellow patrons like Danielle Ramirez, Brandon Buckingham, Brandy Parker, Jeff Alsterman, John Lestrina, Kelly W., Partis Jessidason, and a bunch of others who keep the lights on. I thank you all tremendously for your loyalty and support. It means the world to me. Of course, We do have a couple of different things going on PLD Projects you should check out. We got Class Action Weekly, put up 2 franchises, movies, actors, etc. up against each other with 5 custom-made categories and see which one comes out on top. We have 2 Mediocre White Dudes on Film, where myself and BJ Campbell go through franchise movies, movie by movie, go into a deep dive and review, and we talk about the franchises and movies in general. Right now, we are in the Final Destination series, specifically for our patron, Brandy Parker. And of course, we also are going to be having a new piece of content coming soon in January. Myself and Matty Gunner will be starting a Star Wars podcast, named to be announced. Hopefully, it might be announced already by the time you're listening to this. I don't know, but we'll find out soon enough. Me and Maddie going to break down The Bad Batch when it returns to Disney Plus, and of course all your greatest Star Wars news. Mandalorian Season 3 coming up. A lot of Star Wars to talk about, and I can't wait to do so again. But that's neither here nor there yet. That's going to be in the future. But for now, I am PLD. Thanks for sticking with me. God save the Queen, everybody. Goodbye.